Hello, and thank you for joining us for the TAA webinar, Mentor, Coach, Supervisor, Collaborative Ways to Work with Writers, presented by Janet Salmons and her former mentee, Jim McClesky. Janet is a free-range scholar, writer, and coach. She is the author of the forthcoming book, Learning to Collaborate, Collaborating to Learn, as well as doing qualitative research online and numerous chapters and articles. She is the methods guru and is on sagemethodspace.com. Jim McClesky is an assistant professor of business administration at North American University and a course instructor in the graduate management program at Western Governors University. He received his PhD in organization and management with an emphasis in leadership studies from Capella University and is currently enrolled in a doctorate in business administration marketing program at Liberty University. His research areas of interest include emotional intelligence, leadership effectiveness, leadership emergence, attachment, dark leadership, leadership efficacy, emotional labor, and effect in organizations. He has published more than a dozen articles and written a chapter for a graduate level textbook on research into leadership and emotions. He writes regularly with a small group of scholars separated by thousands of miles and two oceans. Janet mentored Jim as his dissertation supervisor. Hello, Janet and Jim. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Kim, and hello to everyone who is out there and anyone who might be viewing this recording. The topics we're going to explore today, looking broadly at, kind of how we're defining collaboration and some of the elements of the collaborative process, and then thinking about how those ideas apply when we're working as mentors, coaches, or supervisors with other writers, whether it's inside or outside of an academic setting. And we'll explore approaches you can take directly with writers and also collaborative approaches that help to build support and collaboration among a group of writers. And as Kim said, we are looking forward to a discussion, and so we hope that you'll have some questions or comments or thoughts or examples you'd like to add. So we're going to have, kind of a conversational time here, and I couldn't be more delighted to have Jim join me here today. When I was started thinking about this webinar, I thought, this would really be a lot stronger if we demonstrated how we've walked the talk in the relationships we've had. So I'm going to just start by talking a little bit about collaboration, and then we'll get into kind of the heart of the matter. So the definition we're using here is collaboration is an interactive process that engages two or more individuals or groups who work together to achieve outcomes they could not accomplish independently. So, as we're thinking through this, how to think about, the kinds of interactive processes that make sense in a given situation, and, the kinds of outcomes that we're trying to achieve that we've determined could be better accomplished by working together with someone else. So, part of the skill, I think, and understanding of collaboration is knowing when this is the approach to use versus just completing something independently. So I'm just going to, briefly share this taxonomy, which I did discuss in more detail in a previous webinar. And so if you are interested, you can view the recording of that one that we did kind of towards the end of last year. What I want to focus on here today is kind of this top part of the taxonomy, which is kind of the more process-oriented elements of it. The second part of it that we won't really go into today, just there's only so much time we have here, is kind of more around the ways that we divide work up. So in looking at the collaborative process, the elements that we're going to kind of fit with what we're talking about here today. The first is really looking at the individual within the collaboration. So, if I'm working together with you, then I need to start to develop some sense of trust, some belief that we're in this together in a good way, and to just kind of make sense of the process as it goes. I think when we're talking about collaboration in writers, part of that reflective process is also, how can I use what I've learned to improve my own writing? So then, the dialogue, here, just, the communication process that we, want to develop that is respectful and constructive. And understanding that when we are having those kinds of communications online, sometimes the comments we make might be perceived as a bit harsher than we may have intended. So, trying to think about, the communication process that will work for everyone involved, and this includes what kinds of tools we're going to use to communicate and how we're going to share documents and all of that sort of thing. And then importantly, especially to what we're talking about here today, is this review piece. And, we're familiar with the term peer review because that's what we use when we're, in a formal process for journals and book manuscripts, etc. But I think, when we're talking in the context of collaboration, it's essential. We've got to be able to share what we've done with someone else if we're going to either look for constructive critique to improve our work, or to look at how we're going to mesh our contributions into a single outcome. So, in thinking about this for our session here today, okay, I have to get my.
And Janet, I might just tell a story here quickly.
Oh, good.
So when I first began working with a writing group, a writing circle, as we called it, if you remember, it was a group of mentees. You helped kind of arrange for us to get together and work together, and this idea of dialogue and being respectful is so important. The first thing that I looked at for a fellow mentee, I sort of had my instructor hat on, or maybe even my blind peer review hat on, and I gave them a lot of feedback, and I was very detailed, and I thought I thought, wow, that's great. I'm being so detailed and constructive with them, and their reaction was, wow, that was rough. They used the word rough to describe what I had told them. And it was tone, right? My tone wasn't correct. I was, sort of being too sort of teacher-student with them, and they were peers, that was inappropriate. And that's, that has a chilling effect on people's willingness to share their work. And so one of the first things I learned right out of the gate in thinking about this kind of collaboration is when you're working with peers, you have to be careful about your tone, not just the information you're providing, but how it's being communicated. And there's, I'll use a word here, you need a certain amount of compassion to work with your peers in this way.
Right.
And I wasn't demonstrating that at first.
But I think, what you've just described from your own experience also, points back to the reflective piece, because, as you're saying, well, once I heard from the other people the way that they understood my comments, which I thought I was being generous and helpful, well, then, I need to go back and reflect on the way that I'm being understood. And I think that is an important point, whether you're in a peer role or in an instructor, faculty or a coach kind of role. Okay, for some reason there we go. So in this kind of preliminary kind of defining our terms here, one of the things that I want to point out that I think is particularly relevant when we're talking about working with people around writing is that sometimes we are, I think, we tend to expect that if we're talking about collaboration and writing, we're going to put the whole thing together into one outcome. So we're all going to, we're working on an article together or something like that, and we're going to generate one piece of writing that represents all of our work. And that's one kind of collaboration that can be, part of the writing process. But we also might collaborate, kind of more around the learning and exchange and support, but we're going to each, create our own, outcome. So we're going to create our own articles or our own dissertations or whatever it might be. So just as to further define our terms here. And, throughout this, and I think, the comments that Jim made just a moment ago, point to this, the issues of trust are, absolutely essential. So, if we're thinking today from the perspective of a dissertation supervisor, a writing program staff member who is working with students, or a coach or consultant working with people outside of the, kind of a classroom setting, how do we build, kind of the expectation for trust with the people we're collaborating with, and how do we, inspire them to trust us? How do we communicate that we are, in support of, reaching, whatever the shared goal might be for this particular project? And I think, I've already talked a little bit about, the respectful review. And I think this is really at the heart of what we're talking about here today. And, what we, like to encompass is kind of both the formal mentoring or supervising kinds of roles that we have when we're, in an academic setting, and the kind of more informal mentoring or coaching that we might do either in some academic context, but also, in a professional setting. And I know that a number of people in TAA, either work within a faculty role or, work with writers outside of the academic setting. And, in either of those, I really believe that we can do a better job of trying to encourage people, and that, building a more collaborative approach is valuable. Yes, we have responsibilities in each of these settings, but, the way we choose to carry them out, can vary quite a bit. So, we really do. And I found this particular clip art. I thought, this is really, kind of shows it. I mean, the people we're working with are often, really have an awful lot weighing on the success of their writing, whether it's to complete a thesis or a dissertation, to get their articles published. Whether they succeed or not, it's going to have a big impact on their lives and on their careers. So, there's, that places us as the coach or mentor or supervisor in a position of power. But, how do we use that? So I think, I just, want to emphasize today, I'm not suggesting that we ignore the responsibility that we have and the power that we have, in, whatever position we might be in, but to think about the ways to use that could be more positive. I mean, I think, are we trying to support people we're working with, to become our colleagues, or do we have the sense that, we're, going to, always be on top, shall we say? So if we're looking at our relationship with people as one that is, trying to welcome them into whatever the field or discipline is that we're working versus, just I don't know, having a different kind of judgment about where they are, or that, perhaps suffering is just a part of, being a graduate student or making it into the profession, and, we went through it, and you'll have to go through it too. And I think that, we can do better than that. So when I started, thinking about this, for some reason, yes.
And could I speak to that for just a second?
Go for it. Yes.
I don't know if you remember this. You were my second advisor. My first advisor and I had a terrible relationship, but partially, I think, because I always had the impression that this is somebody who just couldn't be bothered really with my efforts or work for the most part, and I never felt like I was, being helped very much, or that they were very welcoming to what I was trying to do. And that was, I'd been in your course and gotten to know you a little bit, and that was one of the reasons that I asked to be moved and asked to work with you. Is I always felt like you were trying to help people get, to that level of being in the academy and having a voice and having something, if not impactful, to say, at least intelligent to say through our writing. And so that was, I think that's a talent that you have, and that could be emulated. Is I always felt very welcomed. I didn't always feel very competent, but I always felt very welcomed, and that you were trying to advance us and sort of grow us up, if I'll use a little term there, into something. And that, and that's not always how that relationship works. As I said, on my first advisor, I didn't get that impression at all.
Well, thank you. And just live and learn. I think, and trying to, take this pretty seriously. So, in thinking about this webinar and thinking about, what I wanted to share, for some reason, this situational leadership model just like popped into my head. It's not something I've thought about for a long time, but I think it can help to kind of explain, and it fits in, either academic or non-academic kind of setting. So the way that this model works is that it shows this progression, or these kind of 4 options. So, at the red level, the directing level, high directive, low supportive. So here is where, we're kind of telling people what to do, or we're, providing the information, and then, kind of turning them loose to do it the way they want to do it. We're not providing a lot of follow-up and that kind of more encouragement, those kind of encouraging behaviors. So then we come up to here where we've got that high directive, because, the person we're working with needs to learn, as Jim was just saying. Well, you're building your competence. If you already were competent, you wouldn't be here, if you already knew how to do whatever it is we're trying to do. So, you do need some direction at that stage, but, combined with high supportive behaviors. So here's where, we're not only saying, well, here, this is the way, we expect this writing to be completed, but also, providing the support. It could be review, feedback, meeting, answering questions, that sort of thing. And then, with the idea that then this would lead us into the next stage, which would be supporting. And here we've got a chance to step back a little bit, because the person is now developing the competence. So we don't need to provide as much of the directive type of action, but we're still continuing with the high supportive behaviors. And then, we hope that ultimately, our mentees are going to get it and, build their strengths and their competence, be able to do whatever it is that they're learning to do. And then, they can go off and do it on their own. They don't need either our direction or our support because, they've got the strength to move on. So I think, the kinds of things we're talking about here today, really the activities that fit into this supporting and coaching area, because I think that, certainly you might have, say, a writing class where the high directive, where I'm teaching how to use APA or, the structure of paragraphs or something like that. But, as we get into, the roles that we're describing as mentor and coach and supervisor, that, we really need to be kind of more in this kind of supporting and coaching domain. And then we hope that our people are going to graduate and go on and be able to actually use the kinds of things we've taught them or that they've learned by working with us. So I think the key questions this brings up for us is, what does the writer need from us? When should we be directive? When should we step in and provide some kind of direction about where the person needs to go? When should we be supportive, and what kind of support is going to be most helpful, and what kind of support can we provide? I mean, obviously there are only so many hours in the day, and probably mentoring, coaching this person is not the only thing we're doing in life. So, we have to put some limits in place. So given that, what are the best choices to make? And, how do we know when it's time to move from those kind of high supportive behaviors to low supportive behaviors?
I'd also say that when you're working with a group of peers in a writing group, as I am now, you share these behaviors amongst each other, right? So depending on the project and the stage of the project, someone becomes more directive about what you're doing. And in my case, so I like to say my German writing friend tends to have some more directive behaviors early on and getting people organized. And versus Raul from Chile, who's a more supportive personality and really only gets directive, I think, when we start talking about statistics, because that's his area of real expertise. And so he sort of takes on a directive role suddenly in our group when we get to the area of talking about analysis and statistics and so forth. And so I really feel that there's an argument to say that these behaviors can be shared in a group of peers as well. And that's one of the things that can help you function in a writing group, whether you're collaborating or just, sharing work with each other and getting feedback. Is certain members may have a more directive style depending on what the activity is or the stage of the process.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And I think, as you point out, I mean, sometimes it's kind of cultural styles, personal styles. Some of us maybe are just more naturally approach things from a supportive behavior, kind of angle versus a directive behavior angle. And at least, in the leadership training that I took where this kind of model was used, the idea was, and going back to the concept of reflection, that, part of the role part of the steps that we need to take as individuals is to think about, where our strengths and weaknesses are. If we're really good at being supportive, but we cannot provide the direction that people need, then they might feel like they're happy with us because in terms of the support, but they don't know where they're going and they may end up wasting some time. On the other hand, if we're someone who is naturally more directive and, then maybe we need to learn some of those supportive behaviors so that we can, have a more balanced approach. I just quickly wanted to mention that kind of, hey, we're not making this stuff up. We're not the only people who are thinking about this. In there are two books that were written. This one is from the 2008 book called The Formation of Scholars, Rethinking Doctoral Education for the 21st Century. and it's from the Carnegie Foundation for Teaching. And here you can see from this quote that they emphasize the intellectual community as an important facet, and kind of point out just the same things that we're talking about here. The opportunity to present your work, respond to work in progress, and interact informally help to raise students' sense of their potential and their ability to function as colleagues. So I just wanted to bring that up. So we're going to talk about two different examples, and these are examples that I've used in a doctoral program, academic setting, but in reading about other uses of these approaches, they are, also, I think, applicable in a more informal setting, whether it's, say, writing program, series of workshops, or even coaching with people outside of the academic setting. So in this first one, writing circles, and I wrote a post for the TAA abstract with a couple of other examples of writing circles. So here I'm just going to talk a little bit about the stages that we used in this writing circle that Jim was a part of at Capella. So at the first stage, discussing publication goals. This was a small group of people who were all aiming to get their work published. And I think part of that process of discussing goals, and this is goals for people to do their individual writing. So this was not a group of people who were trying to write something together. These are all people who are trying to improve their own individual writing. So, this process, I think, of discussing goals, help people to get acquainted and started to build some sense of trust between the members of the group. And then with those goals in mind, the participants in the group then, started to look at, well, where really can I get this thing published that I want to get published? And in this particular case, people were looking at journals. So took some time to do, to research potential places for getting published and what the process would be. And at the same time, then, working on the writing they were completing so that they could have drafts that they could exchange for review. Then, as the circle progressed, we also took the time to discuss the process and the lessons learned, so that not only the work we were doing together, but the work people were doing individually could benefit everyone. And then, going off and working on the article draft to incorporate what was learned and prepare for submission. So I think you can see, from this that, there are some things where, the group is working together, and other stages where people were working more independently. And since Jim was a part of this group, maybe you would like to talk about your experience as a student. This was kind of an experiment, and this was, even though it was a doctoral writing circle, it was not a part of a class. There's no grade involved or anything like that. So this was an informal process, within the academic setting, purely to help people, think through their publication options.
Yeah, I mentioned this group in particular a moment ago as well. I think one of the first lessons was, again, about how we communicate with our peers in an open setting like this, where it's not, a blind peer review situation, and you're not grading somebody's work, and being constructive while still being very, having the right tone, and that idea of being helpful and generous with people. And then I think once we got to know each other a little bit better, and as we were moving closer to our goals, there's also an element of real emotional support in a group of writing peers too. I know my first couple of submissions got rather harsh rejections, and so it's nice to have people to commiserate with as well through that process. And then, you know, thinking about when a lot of us did not understand the process very well at first for getting something published, and also understanding journal quality, you know, aiming the right work at the right journals that have the right themes and cover the right materials. So where does your work really belong? I think that's something that you don't know very much about at all in the beginning. And so as each of us was learning lessons about things like that, you know, we were able to come back and share some of that. I'd also say that we didn't pick each other, and there's an interesting aspect of that. If you set up a writing circle, when they didn't select each other, there's a lot of getting to know each other and a lot of figuring out who has what set of skills and how each person can be beneficial to improving your work and improving your writing. The group that I work with today, we did sort of pick each other, and so we have a little bit, you know, we came into it a little bit differently, and I think that we probably had less of a learning curve than that original writing circle did, but it was a great experience in terms of having a very low stakes environment where it's not for a grade, and you know, you're not rejecting each other's work. And so in that sort of relaxed, low-stakes environment, we could really be honest with each other and provide a lot of feedback and be encouraging about each other's goals as well.
Well, I think you make a good point that, you know, I hope our listeners will think about, and that is, you know, how if you're contemplating a writing circle kind of model, you know, how people might join, you know, will make a difference, especially in terms of kind of the stages of the process and how much time should be allocated. So I think in any collaboration, if we're in a situation where, you know, we meet someone, we think, gee, you know, we get along well, you know, we have the same kind of, we have compatible views of the world and, you know, what it is we want to do. Let's do something together. It's something else when, you know, you're kind of tapped or required or even invited to join. In this particular example that, you know, I have up here on the screen that we used in the doctoral writing circle, people were invited, but they all knew me, but they didn't know each other. So, you know, and that's the case, then I think, you know, taking the time to build trust and to have some kind of more informal interactions before you jump into the peer review stage, which is, you know, that's more challenging. I mean, you know, especially when you're working virtually, to send your work off to someone else and ask them to give you feedback can be a little bit, you know, traumatizing. So, you know, taking the time to get acquainted is valuable. Another point that I would make, you know, if you are trying to facilitate a writing circle of this kind and people don't know each other well, they don't have a lot of that sort of personal level of trust, you know, then one of the ways that you can make that review process more valuable is, you know, there are kind of two approaches. One would be that the group itself will say, members of the group will say, you know, here's what I need in your review of my work right now. So if I'm sending my work to Jim, I might say, would you look at the structure? Does this, you know, does it have a flow? You know, would you comment on that? Or I might say, you know, have I adequately kind of honored the literature? You know, do I need to do more in terms of integrating literature? Then that's what it's going to look at. And so then I can feel more of a trust because I'm controlling the process in a way, you know, I'm creating some parameters, or I might say, please don't look at grammar and spelling at this stage, because this is really just, I'm throwing my ideas out here and I'll clean that part of it up later. Or I might say, would you please look at, my grammar, because maybe this is something I'm not very good at, and if you see anything that is incorrect, please let me know. So, there's that kind of approach of, letting the writers kind of ask each other for the specific kind of feedback they need, or as a facilitator to in a more the type of process where maybe everybody is working on a dissertation proposal, or everyone's working on a journal abstract, or something that, comparable, then perhaps creating a checklist or some kind of a format for the review, so then everyone can feel a little bit there's some safety in working within some kind of defined parameters, rather than just sending it out and hoping for the best. And anything you want to add to any of those points?
Well, I would say two things. First, absolutely. When you're sharing your work with peers, specify what you want them to look at, because otherwise, for one thing, they'll look at everything usually, and then you may not want them looking at everything at that point. And then if you feel like there's a weakness in something you wrote, then draw their attention to that fact. Say, I'm just not sure I've built a great theoretical case here. Can you take a look at my theory development and see if it makes sense for you, and is there anything you think that I need to do there? And that you get much better feedback when you've been specific about what you're concerned about in the work. And then the second thing goes back to the first point about how you pick your collaborators. I had a top scholar in leadership once say at a conference that all great collaborations begin over a pitcher of beer. And I don't know if I would agree or disagree with that, but if that is the method I prefer to as well. So, but how, starting from a social connection, I guess is what I would say, is sometimes a beneficial way to build some connections, for your professional development.
And what I would hope with the use of this kind of a writing circle, for students, is that then people will start to work out for themselves the ways that these kinds of approaches work for them. What they find to be beneficial, so that then when they go out and are in a position to create their own kind of writing group, or support team for getting writing done, they have a sense of what they're looking for. So the second example, and this Jim was also involved with these. So as a dissertation supervisor in an online program, one of the needs that I noticed was that students didn't have the chance for that pitcher of beer or a cup of coffee as easily, because they're working remotely. And that's certainly, I think, even in brick and mortar programs, the isolation people experience when they're in the writing stage for a dissertation, or even as an early career researcher trying to get their initial publications out there so they can advance in their careers. It can be a very isolating situation, and sometimes it's it's hard to learn the skills that are involved in being able to describe your work to someone else, being able to explain it, and speak to what it is you're trying to do. So I created this idea that I called a research cabaret, where in this particular setting, way that we did it was, at the end of each term, all of these doctoral students who are out there working on their own would come in, log into a platform like this one, and share their work in progress, and including the difficult things as well as the successful and exciting things. And this, I think, gave people a chance to, not only, get feedback and give feedback, but to feel more comfortable talking about their research. And, this, again, in thinking about this as a collaborative process, it's an opportunity for collaborative learning about all of the kind of aspects of writing, not only, putting the words onto paper, but it's also being able to communicate with others about, what it is we're trying to do and the questions that we have, so that we can get the help that we might need. Because sometimes we might be struggling with something, but, if we, feel reluctant to share it, or we aren't quite sure how to explain it, that can be difficult. So I think that as we went, this became quite popular, and for the newer members of the group, we're able to, they're really quite impressed by what, the more advanced people, are, farther along in their work had been able to do, and gave them encouragement and kind of inspiration, motivation, say, hey, if they can do it, I can do it. So, in thinking about, kind of writer to writer collaboration, sometimes everyone is kind of at the same stage or at the same level. Sometimes we have, people who are less experienced and other people who are more experienced. So creating some opportunities for exchange that, allow, everyone to, have an opportunity to hear from and learn with the others, I think is a valuable thing. So, Jim, anything you want to describe about your experience with this?
I would say that one of the most valuable points about the Research Cabaret is that when you're in the middle of your dissertation, when you're working and writing, you're very deep in the literature and you're very deep in the subjects. And then if somebody asks you about it and you just begin to speak about it where you are and just talk about it where you are, it's so incomprehensible, right, to them if they're not deep into that same literature. And so I think the nice thing about having to put it together in a format for other students and who aren't looking at it at the level of complexity that you are, is to be able to step back for a minute and take a deep breath and really get that 30,000 foot elevation, look at it again and talk about it in more general, broad terms and in a way that's comprehensible to others. And I think it's hard to do that unless you're forced to, right, when you are really deep in the literature and working on it. And so it's each opportunity to do that, I think, was nice for me to step back and look at it broadly again and think about it in a more general way and try to put it into terms that a person who wasn't as deep in the literature as I was at that moment would comprehend. So that was a neat, cognitive exercise, I think, to step back and have to do that.
Yeah, I think sometimes when we're, working on something, I mean, we might have been, especially a large project, a dissertation, or later on a major research article or a book, you can lose the enthusiasm, shall we say, when you are so deep in the weeds and, just kind of, you're immersed in it, but it just seems like a lot of work, and, you've kind of forgotten that, really inspirational spark that got you going to begin with. And, being able to participate in something like this kind of exchange, then it's a refresher, reignite that spark, and remember, why it was you thought this was important to begin with, because you have to put it into a brief synopsis in order to share it with someone else and get their response, which, hopefully is enthusiastic in a way that would make you go like, oh yeah, now I remember why this is important, and I'll go back to the hard work I need to do to get the whole thing done.
Right. No, absolutely. And then somebody says, oh, that's so interesting. And you think to yourself, is it interesting? Because it doesn't seem that interesting to me anymore. You know, it's just, there's some brutal part of that process, you know, you're going through. But somebody says, oh, no, that is interesting. And you think, yeah, I thought that in the beginning as well. That is how I used to feel about it.
Okay, so let's want to just move on just a couple more points, and then, you know, hopefully we have some other questions and thoughts to discuss. I think, you know, when we've talked about a few aspects of collaboration that can either make people feel comfortable or make them feel defensive or kind of pull back. And, you know, I think the ethical piece of it is important to consider, you know, from the beginning. And, you know, in some situations, if we're in an academic settings, you know, some of the issues might be kind of laid out as a, you know, kind of more part of the formal process. And if we're, you know, outside of an academic institution or outside of a regular, you know, sort of classroom type of setting, then, you know, we need to pause and think through some of these things. So I'm going to let Jim talk to the first point about clarifying authorship and order of names listed, because this is a point that has come up, you know, again and again in other settings I've been in, where ethical, you know, dilemmas have caused a real problem and real strife between people who otherwise, you know, might have gotten along well. So why don't you explain some of the strategies you've used with your writing group, because I thought those were valuable.
Yeah, as it relates to authorship, I think one of the things that we started together from the very beginning that has been really helpful for us is we decide the authorship order before basically we have written a word. I mean, when we're talking about the project just conceptually, we decide from the very beginning what the order of authorship will be, and we stick to it. And we've noted previously between the three of us that if someone is not contributing to the project at the level indicated by their authorship, then we might revisit authorship. We've never had to do that, but we've made it known to each other that we leave that as an option, but we've never had to do that so far. And so I think because we begin right away at the conceptual part of the discussion to declare the authorship, and we use some sort of objective criteria. So if it's your data set that was collected, generally you're going to be first author. In our case, if it's a heavy methods type of discussion, there's going to be a lot of discussion about methods of analysis. Then our resident statistics expert might take first authorship, and we might, you know, look at a statistics-oriented journal for that. And then we also try to keep in mind things like the goal of the individuals. I happen to work for universities where my publication record is not terribly important. And so sometimes if I'm working on a project and I'm being suggested as second author and the third author would benefit more from a publication credit, I might say, you know, let me take third on this. It's less important for me. But we get those. I think the critical point is we've had very little problems, if any, maybe no problems at all about this, because we make that decision before we really get involved in a project together. And so I think that's important to have that clarification. Now, I haven't published with my students to this point, but I was told at some point in my career that if you publish with a student, you ought to take second position with the student. And I know faculty who feel exactly the opposite, and so I can't advise you there because I haven't put that into real world practice yet, but it's my intention to take second authorship if I'm working with a student. So that's, we've been, whether by dumb luck or careful decision making, we did come up with a policy early on that we would settle that first. We've always settled it first, and we've had no conflict in my writing group because of that.
I think, with your example, people who are committed to writing together, over a period of time with multiple publications, then, you can kind of do some give and take in terms of, who might come first, in this article versus that article, and, probably more challenging for people who are, only, they've got this one project and that's it. But I think that some of the points that you mentioned in terms of, say, whose data is being used or where the emphasis is, could at least provide some guidance. We're not going to, in this webinar tell you, how to do it, but simply to say, these are questions that are good to get out there, have a discussion, and come to some agreement at the outset. The authorship issue, respect for others' intellectual property, having some ground rules about not, sharing drafts or excerpts or quotes or anything, outside of the group. That's something that we did with the writing circle we were engaged with. We were discussing a moment ago, and respect for cultural and other differences. And here, sometimes it may be more differences of style, differences of expectation, differences in terms of attitudes towards authority, and that might be particularly relevant if you are in a faculty-student situation. So I want to just to kind of summarize, and then let's open it up for discussion. So some of the kinds of points that we're trying to make here today, beginning with committing to a common purpose and clarifying roles and expectations. So this would include, the coach, mentor, supervisor, not only trying to clarify the expectations for the students or the mentees, but making sure that they have an understanding of, what they can expect from you. And, thinking back to that situational leadership model, what kind of direction are you available to give when a problem arises? What level of support, is realistic to be able to provide in a given situation. So letting people know what they can expect from you and what you expect from them, and what you expect from them in terms of their interactions with peers, is important at the outset. Taking time to think, thinking about the model of the trust and dialogue, building, taking the time to make sure that people can either trust each other because they've built a personal level of trust, or that they trust the process. So, if I trust the process and I think, okay, we've got, ground rules in place, I know that if things don't go well, or I have a problem or a question, I can go to the coach or the supervisor or the faculty member and ask, for some help. Then, I'm okay with proceeding, even if I don't have the, kind of personal level of trust with the other people, just because, I don't know them, but I trust the process. So if we're in the role of coach, mentor, supervisor, then I think that part of our responsibility is to, kind of understand, who these people are, they're involved with this project, what some of the, trip hazards might be in terms of problems that could arise, and to try to build an environment where people will feel good about participating. Because if they don't feel they can exchange their work, talk about their work with others, then they're not going to be able to work collaboratively in a successful way. When we are reviewing others' work or facilitating a mutual review process, to make sure that it's fair and consistent and is, really helpful, based on where the person is at the time, what they need to move forward. Create those opportunities for exchange, whether it's the research cabaret, which is kind of the show and tell type of approach, or a writing circle that would be a more, in-depth process that would include review. One way or another, trying to create some opportunities for people to exchange ideas and get the support and encouragement they need, and the diverse feedback that will help them to strengthen their work. And then finally, to not forget that it's important to recognize when we've had even small accomplishments, because writing is hard, and especially with large-scale projects, it can be discouraging. So, how can we help people to stop and be happy that they've accomplished even some part of the process. So Kim, do we have some questions?
I am seeing one right now, but I do want to let everybody know that if you have a question, you can type it into your in the question box on your control panel on your screen, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can before the top of the hour. So the first question is: it sounds as though there's a large feeling component to successful collaboration. What actions can collaborators take to enhance the feeling of being welcome or supported?
Well, I think that there is a feeling, an affective component, because I mean something, but at the same time, I don't think that it has to be a touchy-feely kind of thing. Again, as I was talking about in this point 3, sometimes that the feeling component can be at a personal level. We really like these other people, where we have fun together, maybe we know them socially outside of the collaboration, and so we don't have to work very hard at it because it comes naturally. But other times, those things are not the case. We're not going to be friends. We're not going to become friends. It's just not the way it is. It's just not. That's not good. That's not what's happening here. And we're busy. We don't have time for that. It's just not a part of what's going on. Then, in that case, I think, we need to look more at the kind of the structure of the process. And so, thinking, here from the role of the coach, supervisor, mentor, it's partly up to us to kind of determine that and to decide whether I need to, say, make time for people to chit-chat because, they need to build that kind of personal trust, or whether, I need to be creating some templates and checklists and timelines, etc. So it's a and review strategies so that people feel they can trust the process and not have to take time to invent the process themselves. Anything you would add to that, Jim?
Yes, I would also say if you're trying to, and I mentioned earlier a couple of times about tone. So one of the things I've learned to do with peers, if I am, trying to kind of be careful with tone, is maybe say something positive at the beginning of my comments or notes, and then get into some specific criticisms, and then maybe end with something positive. You guys are probably familiar with the sandwich method. That's what the sandwich method is, right? You say something sort of somewhat positive and then put your specific criticisms in the middle, and maybe have something positive to end on. And that seems a little trite maybe, but that does help in terms of keeping a fairly positive tone with people. And then I would also say that as long as the people involved in a writing circle or writing group are focused on the goal, which to me is we want to be better writers. We're here because we want to get better, and we want to be more successful with our writing. And whether that's whether it's writing for a grade or for publication or for our organization or for whatever, or if we stay focused on that, then we tend to get along better, right? Because we have that shared objective in common.
Okay, well, do you have any more questions?
Yes. So this is starting with a comment. Great presentation. Thank you. Regarding your point about authorship and taking into account the importance of trust and clear communication, would you recommend to document your co-author's agreement to whatever was discussed verbally, like first or second authorship, etc.? In my experience, some details discussed verbally sometimes are being forgotten in 6 months or so. So what are your recommendations for that? Thank you. And again, great presentation.
I think putting it into writing is a good idea, even if it's just a simple, say we've had a phone meeting and we've chit-chatted about how we're going to move forward and who's going to do what and how much time we expect this to take, or how much time should elapse between stages of the process, and any of those kinds of agreements that, perhaps, a follow-up email summarizing, it's my understanding that this is what we came up with today. It doesn't have to be, formal language, etc. It could just be, here's a recap. Let's just, did I get this right? Are we in agreement about these points? Then we've got, something to come back to. I mean, I just, in my work on collaboration, I think that point about being able to trust the process is really essential. That, and it certainly ties into being able to trust the other people. I'm not saying distrust the other people, but if we trust the process and we have clarity around those kinds of expectations, then that can be helpful. If we start to run into a problem, then we could say, I pulled back that email back up, and when we met in January, we said we were going to do X. Have we changed that? Do we want to revisit this, or is this the way we're moving forward? So in other words, I think it can be friendly. I don't think it has to be like notarized, and in legalese, unless it's something where it's perhaps a larger scale project that might involve, funding and accountability, where we might need a more formal process. But, if we're working with a group of writers in a more informal way, I still think having that a record of our agreements would be valuable.
Yeah, I agree. Our group, we have weekly Skype meetings. We send out an email afterward recapping the meeting. If that was a meeting where we talked about authorship, that would be reflected in the notes. We also operate with a shared Dropbox, a shared drive, and we have always an Excel spreadsheet document that's showing the projects we're working on, the timeline, and those list the authorship and the working title of each thing we're working on. So everyone knows what we agreed to. There's a couple of places where it's in writing, and it's not formal, but if a dispute were to arise later, all we'd have to do is point back to those guiding documents and say, no, clearly that's what we agreed to at the time.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions that it looks like it. I'll end with a comment. This was a great presentation. Thank you very much for the useful tips for how to approach collaborative projects and manage them. So thank you, Jim and Janet, for sharing your expertise with us today, and thank you all for participating in today's presentation.